Hello, Hua Chong students. I'm Mr. Kelvin Tan. So this video I'll be explaining to you how to tackle the essay question for TYS 2021 essay question 5b. Basically, it's the question on GRAMA. We call this the gradual and modest appreciation of the Singapore dollar. Let's move to the next slide. Now, this is basically the question. So I'll let you read on your own first. What I've done here is that I've highlighted the key points: the outbreak of disease, the natural disaster, and the increase in global raw material prices. So in this particular video, we'll be tackling part B, okay, part B, which is given in the next slide. This is the question that we'll be focusing on. Discuss whether the modest and gradual appreciation in Singapore's exchange rate is likely to be the best policy to manage the effects of unexpected external developments. So here are some of my initial comments when I first read this question. Note that this question has a term best. So anytime you see the word best, it implies that there's a need to at least compare the gradual and modest appreciation of the Sing dollar with another policy trying to tackle to manage the effects of unexpected external developments. And of course, since they give you the preamble, you should make some reference to the external developments that are actually stated in the preamble. Let's move to the next slide. Now, here's my favorite points about the tips. For most of these essays, right, take note that there's almost always a connection in essay questions between the first part, which is part A, and the second part, which is part B. It's similar to your math, right? I'm sure when you do your math questions, you have seen questions like saying like A prove something equal to something. Then the second part always asks you hence or otherwise show this. So your math tutor should have told you that no, always do the hence and not do the otherwise. So the point is this: for econs, right, in part A, you would have explained how GRAMA has helped to reduce both demand pull inflation through the balance of trade as well as cost push inflation by reducing import price push, but at the expense of possibly creating a balance of trade deficit. So all these you have done in part A. So in this part B, you are discussing in light of the above, what you've done in part A. Is GRAMA likely to be the best policy to handle the various external developments such as outbreak of diseases, natural disaster, and increase in global raw material prices? Take note that this question was set in TYS 2021, which means those candidates that did this exam in 2021, they are very familiar with COVID-19. So when you want to link to the outbreak of disease, of course, we'll strongly recommend you link the outbreak of disease to the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's the next slide with my tips. Usually when it comes to macro policy that Singapore use, okay, I always tell my students, you cannot run away from two main policies that Singapore often use, which are the exchange rate policy as well as the supply side policy. So my point is this: since this question specifically mentioned exchange rate policy as one of them, for your R2, right, when you talk about the alternative policy to compare with GRAMA, I'll recommend students think about supply side policies for your R2. So this means that in R1, right, you are basically explaining how GRAMA, which is the gradual and modest appreciation of our Sing dollar, helps to manage the effects on external development. And for your R2, explain how another policy, so in this case, supply side policy, also helps Singapore to manage the external developments. What about evaluation? Now, you should be very happy to see this question because since this question part B is on policies, right? As we have told you many times, the standard structure that one should adopt for a question like this is this. You should have your R1, then followed by E1, R2, followed by E2, and then finally E3. What do we mean? R1, right? You talk about how GRAMA help to manage the external developments. So it be followed by E1, where E1 represents the limitations of GRAMA in tackling the external developments. Once you are done with that, you should move to R2, which is supply side policies to manage the external developments, then followed by E2, which are the limitations of supply side policies to manage the external developments. Then finally, E3 is where you take a stand. You take a summative conclusion where you take a stand. Is GRAMA likely to be the best policy, or is it supply side policy, or maybe we need a combination of both? So our point is this: when you write your essay for this particular question, avoid jumping back and forth. Don't jump from R1 to R2 back to R1 to R2 again. So do the R1, E1, R2, E2 followed by E3, so that there's a very nice structure in your entire essay. And typically what HCI will advise you is this: don't write all your evaluation points only at the end. So your E1 should be immediately followed by R1. Okay, try not to write like R1, R2, E1, E2, E3 all at the end together. So it's R1, E1, R2, E2 followed by E3. Follow this structure for the best marks that your marker will give you. Let's look at how you will tackle the R1 and E1. So in R1, right, you will link GRAMA to import push inflation coming from natural disasters and increase in global raw material prices. So here's my hint. Since part A, right, you have already explained this, we tackle part A, you do not need to repeat the same details here, but you could simply ask the examiner to refer back to the points which you did in part A. Now for your E1, right, so the standard way to explain is this: GRAMA at best can tackle import push inflation and maybe inflation coming from demand pull inflation. However, if those external adverse developments also affect supply constraints and also induce higher costs domestically, such as the rise in labor costs, especially during the COVID-19, then you should be aware that appreciation alone is insufficient to mitigate. Appreciation of our exchange rate can handle external costs, but what if the cost is internal, let's say your wage push, then GRAMA will not be good. So that will be the standard limitation of using GRAMA to tackle domestic cost inflation. What about R2 then? So in R2, right, you should be aware of the standard short-run supply-side policies to reduce the cost of business. So since we have said in the evaluation for R1, right, that exchange rate policy, no matter how much you appreciate the currency, you may not be able to handle domestic costs that increases. So if GRAMA is not good for that, then of course the standard alternative policy in R2 will be to use wage subsidies, rental cost subsidies, which these are the many policies we have done during the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are something that you should talk about in your R2 with some good examples. And of course, a very simple evaluation of this point is that such policies, wage subsidies, rental subsidies, is extremely costly for the government. So if you recall, right, when you live in Singapore during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Singapore government had to draw on our past reserves a few times, right, for all the packages to fund it. So this policy is extremely costly. It incurs high opportunity costs. So this is the E2 that you would say. Now, of course, you could have an alternative R2 where you talk about demand management policies instead. So if you want to use this point, right, your external developments, you will say that it will lead to recession in Singapore. So in this case, GRAMA, when you appreciate the currency, that's actually a contractionary monetary policy, which is a contractionary demand management policy. So for this question, since you are facing recession, you may want to use expansionary FP. So if you use this point, right, you should explain the multiplier, draw the ADAS graph. So if you use this point for your R2, your standard E2 will be that, Singapore, our multiplier is small, and you want to focus on the fact that our MPS is high, our MPM is high with good explanation. Now, my tip is this. I wouldn't advise students to use this for R2 because if you say demand management policies such as expansionary fiscal policies, right, all of us know that Singapore's multiplier is small. So if you were to put this as R2 instead of supply side policies in the short run, this will unfairly bias your E3. Your summative conclusion is saying that GRAMA is a better policy. So I would recommend students for the R2, right, stick to the short run supply side policy and not the demand management policy. Suppose you have done that. So what would your E3 be? Okay, so a good conclusion for this question is that whether grammar is the best policy or not, right, will depend on the effects of external developments. So in Singapore, right, since we are a small and open economy, we have all kinds of external developments, not just the three examples stated in the preamble. They can vary in terms of impact on the Singapore economy. So it's unlikely for Singapore to be able to rely solely on grammar as a policy, because all these external developments can impact all kinds of ways. So in Singapore, right, we usually have grammar together with our supply side policies. This will be the final slide. So in most instances, right, some of these external developments would have some lasting or longer term effect, which grammar may not be suitable. So in this case, right, a very simple final stand is that grammar will always remain an important policy for Singapore to manage our trade. Okay, to manage all these external developments that comes from external circumstances. But I would say that for this question, right, we should always be aware that supply side policies are always going to be important to use to complement grammar, to supplement grammar, to help our Singapore economy in the long run to maintain price stability, as it boosts competitiveness and attracts FDI by increasing AS, and complemented, of course, by our grammar. So I hope you have enjoyed this short video presentation, and wish you all the best when you do this essay. Thank you.